Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest Red Raptor Writes. It's already hard enough to believe that my favorite game, BioShock, is over 10 years old. But now its sequel 2? Holy dung! It doesn't even seem like that long ago when my brother and I picked it up from the local GameStop on the release date, February 9th, 2010. I remember a small line of other customers waiting to purchase the new game, and some uncultured GameStop employees confused as to what all the hype was about. Well, if they played the original masterpiece, there'd be no question. When I got home, I binged the heck out of it, and the day after, my school had a snow day, so I binged even more heck out of it. 11-year-old me was certainly a happy customer, but I never considered it on the same level as the first. I thought it was good, but never that good. However, that didn't stop me from constantly replaying it over the years. Over time, I began to have mixed opinions concerning BioShock 2. Sometimes I'll enjoy it just as much as I did back in 2010, but sometimes I walked away disappointed. I've already made a video a long time ago about how I would fix the game, but what about the game itself? How does BioShock 2 hold up after a decade of playthroughs? Is it as good as the original? Is it as bad as... Let's return to Rapture and dig this up. There are some awesome additions to BioShock 2, especially in the gameplay department. Many shiny new mechanics have been added, even as Rapture itself deteriorates, and some from the original have been tightened up for an even smoother experience. Actually, there's enough here to make 2 play completely different. Let's see. The most obvious improvement is the ability to wield both your weapons and plasmids at the same time, instead of swapping between both hands constantly. It just feels smoother and far more natural, needing to do less button pushing to complete your desired attacks. It also helps you string together combos, bouncing your weapon attacks off of your plasmids and vice versa. Research 2 gets a nice makeover, being more fun this time around as it encourages you to experiment in how you kill enemies, as killing them the same way gets you less points over time. Another good change was the hacking puzzle. The originals was perfectly fine, as you had to do the connect the pipes thing, but the sequel created a much faster minigame that required the player to stop a moving needle in the correct zone. Hacking feels like less of a chore, taking up less time, and also not breaking the game's pacing. In BioShock 2, you hack machines while the main game is still in action, not pausing the action like before. Every weapon now has a melee attack, which helps string together the long-range gunfights and the up-close and personal battles. Upgrading plasmids is now less of an invisible stat boost. Here, each additional plasmid upgrade adds these epic new abilities. For example, Incinerate begins as your typical fireball, Incinerate 2 becomes a big burst of flames that can encompass several enemies, and Incinerate 3 is just a flat-out flamethrower. You can see the changes and improvements with each upgrade. Additionally, there are new weapon upgrades. While some are mere stat boosts like the original, if you upgrade a specific gun enough, you unlock a potential third upgrade that drastically changes its application. The drill can go from a fun toy for smashing faces into a bullet deflector. The rivet gun can light enemies on fire, the shotgun electrifies enemies, and so on. These are really cool additions that add more variety to the way you play. And finally, there's just more stuff in general. More plasmids, more tonics, more slots, more upgrades, more enemies. I see this as an absolute win. So, BioShock 2 has all the mechanics that made the first so amazing. Many of the same enemies, the same kinds of weapons, same plasmids, many of the same tonics. But this game has a condition which I'm going to name Arkham Knight Syndrome. The mechanics are top-notch and feel extremely polished since its predecessor, but the general gameplay built around those mechanics isn't all that great. Arkham Knight has it much worse in this regard, but the disease comes around here too. Okay, no more beating around the bush, I'm just gonna say it. BioShock 2 is way too easy, like, as in not challenging at all. Well, to elaborate, the early game, probably the first half, can be pretty difficult at points, but Subject Delta gets such a huge power spike at the halfway point without the enemies becoming more powerful as well. This occurs between Siren Alley and Dionysus Park. By the game's final levels, the player is an unstoppable monster who can one-shot nearly anything and everything. Even the quote-unquote tougher enemies go down like chumps if you've upgraded properly. Here's a good laugh. The Rumbler. Designed to be the ultimate Big Daddy, you can easily kill them without taking a single hit. All of their attacks are catchable with the telekinesis plasmid and can be flung back at them while you're shooting. Even the final enemy introduced, the Alpha series, falls like nothing once you learn how to deal with them. Being the first in the series, BioShock didn't have as refined mechanics, but it cleverly avoided this power problem. First, it was sure to make the enemies more difficult around the game's halfway point, so they could match the player's growing power. Like, for example, Leadhead Splicers went from your average enemy with a pistol to a tank who could absorb lots of damage before going down or taking you down with their deadlier machine guns. The original game upgraded its foes, while the sequel leaves the player growing while the enemies stay stagnant. To add to that, BioShock had moments where the player was far more vulnerable. At the finale of Neptune's Bounty, the player had to relinquish all their newly acquired guns, fighting the boss and a wave of splicers with only plasmids and the wrench. Then, in the late game, the opposite happens. After obtaining Lot 192, the player cycles through random plasmids with no control over which one they have at the time. For the most part, you have only your weapons to rely on for Apollo Square. With these things in mind, the original stayed far more challenging as the game progressed than the sequel. Oh, and also, Little Sisters suck now. Yes, they get a nice redesign, but now a solid half of the gameplay time is dealing with the little brats, finding them, killing their protectors, gathering, oh my god, the gathering, and fighting the big sister. Yeah, it all takes way too long. Gathering is a problem that can easily be solved if Delta only had to complete 1 per sister for 80 Atom instead of 2 for 40. This would keep the Atom prices balanced while speeding up what feels like such a tedious process that you just don't care by the late game. Someone please make this a mod. And finally, the big sister, or should I say, the big wasted opportunity. There's just so much potential there that's just never built upon. So once the original Little Sisters grew up, between the first game and the present, they went feral. Instead of letting them go to waste, they were given a cool suit and a mission to kidnap new girls from the surface in order to fulfill Lamb's Atom-infused dream. They also come to protect the new batch of sisters once their big daddies fall. Big sisters are the most challenging enemies in-game, but I just wish more was done with them. They only come to fight you once you deal with a level's final sister, so there's never any surprise or tension. You know exactly when one is coming, so you can always prepare and take them down without much of a sweat. But say you suck at video games, then the big sister is a real pain in the butt, because the moment you spawn from the Vita chamber, they come chasing you again. So even if you have no money or health, you're stuck in a constant battle with these freaks and cannot progress in the story until she's dead. Big Sisters have the look, and the sound, and the ferocity, but aside from that, they aren't implemented well at all. Early promotional material for 2 hinted that Big Sister wasn't just an enemy type, but a single enemy who consistently hunted Subject Delta. We can easily assume that this was Eleanor's original role instead of Damsel in Distress. It would have been so amazing and terrifying if Big Sister served a similar role to Nemesis, an unstoppable monster who pursued the player, getting us to wet our collective pants. Man did they disappoint. Oh well. The story in BioShock 2 is very basic and straightforward, and for the most part, fails to justify its own existence. I mean, the first one ended with such a neat bow on top that reopening the box is clearly a mistake. Rapture's story ended with the deaths of Ryan and Fontaine. Now, it just feels like we're back because a sequel to the greatest game ever made is bound to make a lot of money.
We've got to have money.
Basically, the story is just a more elaborate version of Save the Princess in the Tower. Except this time around, the princess is a former little sister, the tower is a lab under Fontaine Futuristics, the knight is a metal behemoth, and the dragon is a communist. With these few tweaks, BioShock 2 religiously sticks to this formula and refuses to take any interesting twists and turns and reveals. From beginning to end, your mission is to find your little sister, Eleanor, and get out of Rapture. That's it. Not only does it make the story feel extremely generic, but causes it to pale in comparison to its predecessor, the game known for one of the best twists of all time. But even besides the twist, the first game still split itself into 3 distinct acts, in which the player has unique goals. At first, it's to find Atlas's family, then it's to kill Andrew Ryan, and the ending has you defeat Fontaine. The story progressed, there was drama, and you were brought along the emotional roller coaster. Again, in the sequel, Delta is set on only one thing: finding Eleanor. This devastates the plot too, as every plot point feels like unnecessary stalling. Seriously, think of all the major levels in the game. Once on his quest, the player has to venture Ryan Amusements to find Incinerate and melt the ice blocking your train. Pauper's Drop is all about fishing a key off the old lady Grace Holloway so the train can pass. Siren Alley is about unflooding Dionysus Park so you can get back on the train after getting torpedoed out. Dionysus Park could have ended with you hopping on the train, but nah! The station is locked down again, so you have to run errands for reporter Stanley Poole. Guys, seriously? Seriously? Most of BioShock 2's runtime is just endless stalling. Honestly, you can skip from Atlantis Express to Fontaine Futuristics and miss nothing significant aside from some extra backstory. Can you imagine doing the same thing with any other game? Try going from Welcome to Rapture all the way to Point Prometheus and see how much makes sense without anything in between. It's laughable how stagnant the sequel is. To counter that, there are a lot of positives on the character side of things. On his journey to Eleanor, Delta runs into a lot of familiar faces who he has many scores to settle with. The character dynamics in this game are very interesting, as each person you come across has had some involvement in your transformation into a Big Daddy, with Eleanor as your daughter. Ultimately, the player has to decide how they feel about their past. Is Delta content with his life together with Eleanor, or is he resentful for becoming a science experiment doomed to a life of servitude? you show your attitude through the way you interact with these characters. Great mixture of character, story, and gameplay. Grace, although not directly involved in the Protector program, was Eleanor's caretaker once Lamb was removed from the picture. Yeah, we'll get to that later. This was until she was kidnapped and transformed into a little sister. Later on, after seeing Delta and Eleanor together, she blamed him for Eleanor's less than stellar state and sends waves of splicers at you once you arrive in the drop. The whole thing is based on a misunderstanding that you were the cause for Lamb becoming a sister and not a victim yourself. So the player has to make the choice. Do you forgive Grace for her mistake, or kill her for becoming a thorn in your side? Stanley Poole? Well, he's the real man to blame, kidnapping Eleanor to sell her to a little sister's orphanage once she threatened to expose him for using her mother's wealth to throw wild parties in Dionysus once Sophia Lamb was incarcerated. After finding Raptor during a scuba trip, earning himself the name Johnny Topside, whoever Delta used to be was ratted out to Ryan by none other than Stanley. This earned him a one-way trip into the Protector program. Without Stanley, Delta wouldn't have been bonded to Eleanor and thus would have avoided all his problems. There's no real reason to spare Stanley, but he thought you were cool before you became a science experiment, so I guess that's something. Overall, it's a great addition to the series that you get to interact with more characters who aren't crazed splicers. The moral choice is more than a simple black and white button prompt like we're used to. Very similar to Cohen, do we forgive those who wrong us, or have their sins been too great to let them survive? This in turn brings us to more negatives, starting with Gil Alexander. We have a cool story here. Gil had close ties to Sophia Lamb and her Raptor family. He was even chosen before Eleanor to become the first perfect utopian by immense infusions of Adam, collecting all the memories of Rapture and using them to serve only the greater good. Similarly to Jack, who had no choice but to serve others as he was a mind-controlled slave. The end result though was just Alexander becoming a psychotic blob of Adam. So anyways, Gil saw his mental decay coming, so he left audio diaries that guide their finder on how to kill him. It's basically a mercy killing, which is far different than the other two killable characters, yet BioShock 2 treats all of these as exactly the same. Again, let me rephrase that for emphasis. Killing a giant, mindless blob out of sheer respect for the wishes of his former self is shown as equal to murdering a woman who didn't like you because she misunderstood that you kidnapped her foster child. Let's say you spare Grace but kill Stanley as you should. Whether or not you finish Alexander sways Eleanor's thoughts on mercy and can result in influencing her to let her own mother drown. Nuance is totally lost. Okay, moving on from that, we have Augustus Sinclair. Sinclair is like this game's Atlas. He's the guiding voice our protagonist follows throughout the game as he tries to get us out of Rapture. Yes, he has some good dialogue, yes, he's very well voice acted, but man, he becomes such a wasted opportunity. Simply put, Sinclair is basically a mini Fontaine, a rich business tycoon who exploited the vulnerable for his own financial gain. Now that Rapture's in ruins, he's making an attempt to reach the surface to sell Rapture's secrets to the world. It seems that the only difference is that Sinclair is working with you instead of flat out using you. You would think that this becomes a point of major contention, but nah, you just go along with it. Actually, Sinclair has more to do with the transformations of Delta and Eleanor than anyone else. Sinclair opened Persephone as a detention center for Ryan. Sinclair kept Delta, previously nicknamed Johnny Topside, imprisoned. Sinclair used prisoners for testing, and Sinclair sold you out to be converted. If Delta would have to make some grand, dramatic choice about anyone, it should be him. But again, BioShock 2 never goes there. The two are just buddies through and through. Yes, you do kill him in the end, but only because he's been transformed into an alpha series by Lamb. so you never get the chance to judge the greatest culprit in the entire game. Like everything else about this sequel, for every pro, there's a con. For every mistake, there's redemption. BioShock 2's setting is no different. Raptor is one of, if not the most memorable location in all of gaming. What the first BioShock crafted was nothing short of a masterpiece, and with the second one, we get a more intimate view of it from our new perspective as a Big Daddy. One cool addition is being able to walk around the outside of Rapture. In the original, we were constrained to the many skyscrapers, or surface scrapers in this case, because, well, take one step outside and the pressure would flatten Jack. As in Alpha series, Delta gets the luxury of exploring the seafloor, getting some beautiful views of Ryan's fallen dream. And these segments serve as a nice break from the high-intensity, guns blazing we've grown accustomed to. Another neat addition is how this one shows the player more of the underside of Rapture. We see more of life on the wrong side of the tracks. Yes, the original had Apollo Square, but BioShock 2 drags and fleshes this out a lot more with the Slum Paupers Shop, Red Light District Siren Alley, and Prison Persephone. To make things even bleaker, Rapture's been in ruins for a decade at this point, now with even more flooding and plant life taking over. This creates a stark contrast to the areas of the first game, which were very grand and boastful of Rapture's exceptionalism. They were run down for sure, but still much brighter than the very decrepit places in 2. To build upon the time gap, we see how much more splicing has taken a toll on the dystopia's denizens after a decade compared to only a few years. The enemies you come across are far more disfigured, tumorous, and nasty. Admittedly, this does make them look cartoonier than the original, but overall, these are still nice details to have. Additionally, we learn more about the Protector program and the process behind the creation of these iconic duos. New Big Daddies are introduced, the Alpha Series and Rumblers. Alpha Series were the original Big Daddies, the test subjects, sort of like prototypes if you will. Delta is one of these, but all the other remaining Alpha Series have gone insane due to not having their little sisters anymore. It's either that or a coma. Their introduction raises the stakes for Delta because we see what he'll become if he doesn't reach Eleanor on time. Rumblers were created by Alexander to be the strongest protectors, equipped with a rocket launcher and mini turrets. These guys absolutely wreck mobs of splicers, but again are entirely defenseless against telekinesis. Anything else? Oh, the audio diaries. Those are still great. I love how, like the first game, they built these little side stories that don't necessarily relate to the immediate plot, but contribute plenty to expand the world of Rapture. The most memorable here probably being the story of Mark Meltzer, an average guy whose daughter Cindy was kidnapped on the surface by a big sister and brought to Rapture. He followed them there, but got caught and transformed into a Big Daddy, so him and Cindy can be together again.
Would you get out of here?
There's some great stuff here, but now I have to head into the negatives again. I know I just mentioned how I enjoy seeing the other side of Rapture, the poorer, more run-down areas, but this comes at a cost. Color. Many locations in BioShock 2 are visually uninteresting as everything is draped in either brown or gray. Pink corals and blue butterflies help break it up, but not nearly to the extent of the original, which had the lush greens of Arcadia and neon lights of Fort Frolic. So yes, this may sound nitpicky, but some more interesting designs would have been nice. Our return to Rapture shows us some neat stuff, but once again, this installment is completely unjustified considering how the original ended. Everything was neatly wrapped up once Fontaine collapsed to the needles of the Little Sisters. In order to create a new journey to Rapture, many eggs had to be broken for this omelet. Starting off, Sophia Lamb. Who is she and why is she here? Okay, yes, I know she's a psychiatrist brought to Rapture in order to help citizens suffering depression due to the lack of sunlight. I get it, but her introduction comes out of nowhere. BioShock 2 builds her up to be this popular political figure in Rapture, one of Rapture's greatest minds, even going head to head with Andrew Ryan on the debate stage and leading her own cult. But if she's as important as this game claims she is, then why didn't Lamb ever get even a mention in the first one? Of course, the answer is because they didn't think of her yet, but that's the thing. Some serious retcons have to be made for this story to exist. Lamb escaped prison at the onset of the Civil War, so did she ever meet Atlas? Were they acquaintances or rivals considering they were competing for the same impoverished demographic? Where was her influence in the poorhouses we visited? How come we didn't come across any other collectivists before? Maybe I'm being mean, but this is like saying that Donald Trump was at the Constitutional Convention, an obvious rewriting that would raise several questions. You can't plop such a big figure into a story they had no part of and expect everyone to buy it. Okay, enough of her. Andrew Double Shrekking Ryan, one of my favorite characters in all of gaming, gets absolutely butchered here. Here's why. BioShock did an amazing job at establishing and developing his character over the course of Rapture's story. Small details were intricately woven to build the man's arc, showing the player how he became who he was and how Rapture fell with him. Andrew Ryan began Rapture as a total ideologue, believing that when free of government, religion, and the West's phony ethics, mankind would be free to thrive under its own supervision. Rapture was built as a testament to the power of human nature and the free market. Any government intervention in the market was seen as a crime against humanity. Here's an amazingly acted and brief summary of his beliefs.
I believe in no God, no invisible man in the sky. But there is something more powerful than each of us, a combination of our efforts, a great chain of industry that unites us. But it is only when we struggle in our own interest that the chain pulls society in the right direction. The chain is too powerful and too mysterious for any government to guide. Any man who tells you different either has his hand in your pocket or a pistol to your neck.
However, Ryan started to change once challenged by the growing threat of Fontaine. Fontaine forced Ryan to enact policies that he would have previously considered immoral. The death penalty was put into place to intimidate Fontaine's growing smuggling ring. And after Fontaine supposedly died, Ryan nationalized Fontaine Futuristics. But things only got worse from there. Once Atlas arrived on the scene with his riots, civil war broke out. This is when Ryan went mad with power, restricting travel, banning public congregations, enacting curfews, shutting down shops, and silencing anyone who disagreed with him. Eventually, he won the war by lacing plasmids with pheromones he could control the splicers with, leaving Atlas without an army. We went from capital punishment to mind control, a far leap for a free market, anti-government objectivist, but the player got to see the natural progression from one action to the next. As new challenges arrived, Ryan slowly went further and further away from his original ideals that you couldn't even recognize him anymore. Like the extremely developed character he was, Ryan gave this recording in an audio diary.
Could I have made mistakes? One does not build cities if one is guided by doubt. But can one govern in absolute certainty? I know that my beliefs have elevated me just as I know that the things I have rejected would have destroyed me. But the city, it's collapsing before my... Have I become so convinced by my own beliefs that I have stopped seeing the truth? Perhaps. But Atlas is out there, and he aims to destroy me and to destroy my city. To question is to surrender. I will not question.
He knew how far he's gone, but he kept finding ways to justify his horrendous actions. And I explained this entire backstory just to tell you that BioShock 2 throws it all out the window. No, seriously, this character arc that defined the shape of Raptor was just forgotten. Now in 2, Ryan is just a brutal dictator through and through. At this point, you should be able to tell that this installment severely lacks nuance. No progression, no questioning, nothing. He's just plain evil. Nearly every single audio diary from or about my once beloved character is only ever about him silencing and controlling and arresting. Also notice his profile and acting. In the original BioShock, he comes across as an astute businessman who speaks clearly and powerfully. In 2, he looks like a hopeless drunk who's afraid to tell his wife he got fired for drinking on the job again. Although it's the same actor, Armin Shimmerman, this time he always sounds sleazy and conniving.
Do you remember what you told me, Bill? A marketplace of ideas. That was you. If I submit to the debates with Lamb, we defang her. I've done so. And have you been to Pauper's Drop, Bill? Listen.
When you're down and out.
Between each song, these Oblomovs hand out her manifesto. Her face adorns every wall. Saint Lamb. You made her, McDonough. And now, you will convince the council to sponsor her silence.
Okay, I'm done. Mini-rant over. One final nitpick I have with the setting: Rapture doesn't work with Lamb's ideology. Rapture was Ryan's baby, built with his ideas in mind. Everything about it, from the architectural style to the art, glorified human nature and laissez-faire capitalism. It was like a slice of 20th century New York. Around every corner you turned, there was another human figure. But now, it's collectivist, but with all the same details from before. It follows Lamb's ideology of total selflessness, that any act of selfishness has to be removed from the human gene in order to create a utopia based on serving the common good and never the individual. A city built around Lamb's philosophy would look more Moscow and less New York. The two just don't mesh well together. I'm sure there's plenty more that can be said about this decade-old game on both the positive and negative side. And that's the thing about BioShock 2, there's just so much of both. There were so many brilliant ideas and genuine improvements put into it, but with every step forward came another step back. Many gameplay mechanics are built upon, but the gameplay itself is way too easy. The story is severely lacking, but we get some interesting character dynamics, even if some of them are flawed or don't reach their highest potential. We see new aspects of life in Rapture, but the Rapture we return to is a rewritten one that isn't nearly as interesting as it used to be. That's why ranking it has been so tough over this 10-year period. Some gamers see all the mechanical improvements over the original and think, yeah, this is clearly a better game. But some more critical viewers look at all the flaws and think, wow, what a disappointment. The first words I ever heard. Is there enjoyment to be had here? Definitely. BioShock 2 is a ton of fun. Is there a lot to be upset with? Sadly, yes to that too. Perhaps I've balanced out over all these years of going back and forth, but I can't call BioShock 2 a great game, and I also can't call it a bad game. It's a fun game, an enjoyable game, a totally unnecessary sequel that doesn't live up to the name, but also doesn't ruin it. Well, mostly. At least things don't get any worse from here. You know, if the series ended with a thud followed by a great DLC, I can live with that. It's not like anything terrible released to ruin the BioShock name.
Oh my God!
Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to please leave a like and subscribe. See you next time.